Good evening. Welcome back to the Henry George School. And we do apologize for the little issues that we are having with sharing the screens, but we hope to work on it hopefully next time. Tonight, we are meeting again to continue our conversation on the Fed with Dr. Perry. And the title of the talk is The Fed's Other Mandate, Facilitating and Regulating Wage Slavery. Dr. Perry, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahima. And thank all of you for coming back for this. I'm going to do something a little different than I had planned, because after I posted the link to the recording of the first of these sessions, I got a great deal of correspondence. Those of you who sent it to me know who you are. I've answered some of it, but when I say it's a great deal, it's truly a great deal. But what I was afraid of was that some of the foundational points that I made in the first of the talks, which were necessary for building on in this talk about the Fed's mandate for employment, seem to have been either misunderstood or missed entirely. And I wrote a couple of private explanations to people trying to explain them. And then when I realized that there were a number of examples of the same points being missed, I decided that it would probably be best to start off with a recap of the last talk. And anyone who feels that I should be stopped and the point I'm making be challenged is more than welcome to do so. Because if I can't establish these points, then I lack the foundation for the conclusions that I want to draw. So, Ibrahima, if you wouldn't mind giving me the next slide. Okay. In the first of these talks, I discussed first my methodology. This is something new. This is not something you will see anywhere else. It's not actually new in the sense that I have been working on it for some 45 years, but it is not by any means generally accepted. In fact, I'm not sure you would find it used anywhere else. But what I call computational semantics, or the elaboration of a semantic understanding, follows a certain number of guidelines, which I'm going to use in the macroeconomic analyses in these talks. First, it's the converse of the case method. And I have argued since the 1970s that machine learning and what is now being called generative AI, or large language model processing, natural language processing, is nothing more than the case method, which was developed by Christopher Columbus Langdell in 1870 and was the basis on which he founded the Harvard Law School to teach this particular methodology. In a nutshell, the case method begins by isolating a number of decided cases. In AI, this is known as assembling a training set of data. From those decided cases, then by inductive logic, a group of principles is abstracted, and those principles are deemed to provide the basis on which the body of decided cases was in fact analyzed and decided. Then with those principles isolated and articulated, it becomes possible to decide new cases and new questions on the basis of the principles which by this case method have been demonstrated to be the abstract or inductive basis on which the previous set of cases had been analyzed. This is all that AI does. And it is seriously intellectually deficient. I'm only going to cite two of the places where because this is its methodology, it is incapable of performing an analysis on data in the real world. The first is that almost by design, this case methodology cannot recognize emergent properties. All it can do is match patterns to the principles or the classifications which have been induced from the original training set of data. That is a particular problem if you're trying to use this for drug discovery or market analysis or any intellectual field where the thing you're looking for, the thing of importance, the salient indicators are the emergent properties. But at a far more fundamental level, this is a crippling intellectual deficiency, which requires us to understand Darwin in order to understand why this is such a fatal flaw in methodology. In the real world, there are no patterns. In the real world, there is no design. However, the human mind is particularly well suited to pattern matching and to the discovery of patterns in data which the human perceives in the real world. I won't get into the arguments which are the very basis of modern Darwinism for why the Darwinian notion of speciation utterly disproves and discredits the notion of inducing general patterns or general principles from data and then using those general patterns or general principles to process novel data. For the moment, I'm simply going to say that if we use that methodology, we are ipso facto imposing a purely human construct on data in the natural world where that construct does not exist. And I won't get into the problem of whether the social sciences, or as opposed to the hard sciences, are themselves more manifestations of the workings of the human mind rather than they are of data as experienced in the real world, except to say that when we perform a semantic elaboration of real world data using the tools of Darwinian speciation, we can demonstrate an actual chain of causality. We can demonstrate the etiological rather than the ontological identity of the values we're seeing. And if we follow along with that method, if you follow me with that method for at least the rest of this talk, I hope you will see that that's what we're able to do with macroeconomic data. Next slide, please, Ibrahima. Okay. I am using my own idiosyncratic premises for this particular macroeconomic analysis. It is based on the assumption that current ontological definitions of whichever of the terms of economics we might be discussing are essentially bogus, if not fraudulent. And that instead of ontological definitions, we must build etiological definitions from a transactional provenance. What does that mean in simplest terms? It means that property X is not property X. Any identity is not that identity because as a noun or a noun structure, which is to say ontologically, it conforms to a schema for that structure. It is X. It is the identity that we claim it to be because it has been synthesized through an etiological process, which defines as a verbal process of transformation what that identity is, rather than defining that identity by a static noun-based ontological schema. Next slide, please. Okay, in the last talk, I covered these 5 emergent properties within the 21st century in US macroeconomic history, all of which should have been recognized as emergent properties, each of which fundamentally changed the nature of the transactions in the US economy. But because of the static and ontological analysis, because of the case method analysis, which is commonly applied in macroeconomics, not one of these 5 was recognized as being an example of an emergent property, which should have been treated as something new, imparting an entirely new dynamic to the evolving system, rather than have been classified as a new example fitting an old pattern. Next slide, please. So the etiological pattern, which we can see beginning in the early 1990s, which demonstrates emergent properties which have utterly changed what we confront, what the actual identities of the attributes of the properties of the US economy are, have been first the Greenspan put, the notion that the Fed will intervene in order to preserve market valuations. The Troubled Assets Relief Program, which established the novel notion that the banks had no separate identity from the Fed, that assets on a bank's balance sheet could be taken onto the Fed's balance sheet at a valuation determined solely by the Fed, and that they would remain assets of value in the economy. That means there's no legal distinction between the Fed as an entity and the banks as entities. Quantitative easing, which instead of managing the money supply by virtue of pressure of interest rates, the Fed manages the supply of credit directly through its own open market operations to allocate credit as a principal dealer. These allocations of credit go onto the Fed's own balance sheet, so that rather than the Fed acting separately from the economy, the Fed's balance sheet becomes the cumulative credit of the economy as a whole. And finally, the question of sanctions, the most extreme example being those imposed on the Russian central bank and the sovereign wealth of the Russian people in March of 2022, where the Russian central bank was aware that US dollar reserves that could be reached by the US Treasury would likely be seized. But it never occurred to the Russian central bank, nor to anyone outside of the US Treasury, that assets denominated in US dollars, which could not be physically seized, reached through negotiation or legal process, would in fact simply be invalidated. But the Office of Foreign Asset Control within the Treasury took the opportunity to act upon its longstanding contention that dollars were only dollars if they were acknowledged to be so in the Fed's own ledger, so that the very existence of the dollar reserves of the Russian central bank could be obliterated, invalidated by simply making ledger entry changes in the Fed's computer. This means that not only is the US dollar not money, retroactively, we must say it has never been money, since if the store of value can be arbitrarily and unilaterally invalidated, then by definition, it was never a store of value in the first place. Next slide, please. All right, so the implications of these newly established principles, established in this case by the etiology of which they were synthesized, rather than abstracted by the case method from data, are that one, there's no legal distinction or boundary between the Fed's balance sheet and the balance sheet of the banks. Two, there are no rights of ownership in US dollars. And three, there is no free market in US dollars or debt. The US dollars and US dollar denominated and US Treasury debt is worth, for purposes of transactions, what the Fed says it's worth, which may in fact be zero. And on this last point, we now, since the talk I gave in January, have seen the new settlement rules, which are intended to discourage the basis trade, in which what had once been a party-to-party over-the-counter market in US debt now requires all parties to settle at a single central on-the-books clearinghouse, which will be operated ultimately by the Fed. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the first talk, I reached a number of what I consider to be semantically proven conclusions. One, inflation is not expansion of the money supply, is expansion of the money supply. It is not price inflation. Next slide. Since 1971, since the Nixon surprise, there is no money supply. There is simply a credit supply, because this thing that we are talking about the supply of can never actually be resolved to specie, or indeed resolved to a reified unit of value which can be transferred in a peer-to-peer transaction. Next slide. The public credit, which is allocated to banks, becomes private credit, except there may not be any meaningful category such as banks. If the banks are simply a group of line items from the Fed's balance sheet, as the Fed has treated them since the troubled assets relief program in 2009, then it is arguable that there is no such thing as private credit. And we have seen that credit is only removed from the economy by taxation. since no debt is ever retired. It's automatically rolled over. There has been no retirement of any federal debt in this century. So, what does this imply about the working of the economy as a whole? First, the Fed creates credit. The Fed essentially allocates that credit. Historically, some portion of that credit was allocated to the banks, which then, by converting that public credit into private credit, were able to allocate it as private debt to their borrowers. But as we saw in March of 2023, with the collapse of Silvergate and Signature and Silicon Valley banks, the Fed does not recognize any distinction between items it regards as of value on its balance sheet and items which would otherwise be subject to the rules of bankruptcy and creditor claim because they are on the balance sheets of the banks. The inescapable implication of that is that there really is no such thing as private credit and no such thing as private debt any longer. There is one creator of credit, that is the Fed. There is one allocator of credit, that is the Fed. And there is one lender, that is the Fed. Whether the Fed conducts that lending directly on its own balance sheet as the sole functioning banking entity in our economy, or whether it does it through a two-step with the banks or through the federal reverse repo facility or through short-term treasury dealings, there's really only one banking entity. And that banking entity creates credit, which it then allocates into the real economy. Next slide. Okay. That credit may be allocated to the productive or the non-productive economy. What do I mean by that? Next slide. We know whether the credit has been productively or non-productively allocated by the simple measure that the productive allocation of credit fuels the gross domestic product. The purpose of credit in the productive economy is to fuel production. Allocating credit to the productive economy will produce at least a one-to-one increase in gross domestic product. Next slide. On the other hand, we know that the credit has been allocated non-productively, that is, into financialization, if instead of producing gains in gross domestic product, it engenders asset bubbles. Because anything that the Fed allocates credit to, which does not, at least on a one-to-one ratio, increase production, is by definition a non-productive or financialization use of that credit. And any non-productive use of credit will inevitably produce asset bubbles within the classes of asset to which the Fed has allocated that credit. Next slide. Okay, the fiscal reality. And this is not going to change. The two political parties at this point exist, each to fight to the death on its piece of this fiscal reality. There is no political path to raise taxes, and there is no political path to cut spending. And if you look at the details as they're being leaked out of the bipartisan stopgap spending bills that Congress is working on today, you will see the truth of that. There literally is no place for either party to permit the priority of the other party. We are literally stuck in a deadly embrace. Just a lemma here. I have noticed this happened only one other time in our history, and that was in 1850, and it happened as a consequence of the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 ended the historical tie in the Senate. From the time that Kentucky and Tennessee were admitted to the Union in the Washington administration, the Senate was evenly balanced between North and South, and it continued to be evenly balanced between North and South. You effectively had states admitted in pairs. In 1804, Ohio and Louisiana; in 1817, Indiana and Mississippi; in 1819, Illinois and Alabama; in 1820, the application of Missouri for admission to the Union caused Congress effectively to formalize what they had been doing since the first Congress, which was maintaining the balance between North and South by a tie in the Senate. Despite all the problems with the admission of Missouri, it was facilitated by admitting Maine as a northern state to counterbalance Missouri as a southern state. That pattern then continued under the name of Missouri Compromise from 1820 until 1850, when California applied for admission to the Union. The Senate's first response was to say that California would be divided and admitted as two states. But the constitutional organizers of California refused to permit that. And they insisted on being admitted as a single state. In the Compromise of 1850, the southern states gave up the demand which had characterized their policy for dealing with admission of new states since the first Congress, and allowed California to be admitted as a single state, thereby breaking the tie in the Senate. The tie in the Senate had made it impossible to debate the big issues. And actually, the big issue for all of US history up to that point wasn't slavery, despite the lectures Nikki Haley has been getting recently. It was the tariff, and we won't go into that, but the fundamental questions could not be debated because there was no way to win the debate. And it was the tie in the Senate that assured there was no way to win the debate. Consequently, the smaller details, the logistics were worked out, and the great Senate debates were about trade policy, tariff, and ultimately foreign policy and war. Once the tie in the Senate was broken, the inevitable result was political partisanship, because the advantage was to be gained by taking ever more radical positions within the parties, which leads ultimately to the Civil War. I went off onto that long lemma because I think we have now arrived at a very similar position. The two parties we have are locked into intractable positions which they cannot get out of, which in terms of fiscal policy mean that there will continue to be no path to increase taxes, and there will continue to be no possibility of cutting spending. And certainly that's borne out by the data of the last 5 years, particularly when we see that the annual deficit between revenues and expenditures went from $600 billion to $1.6 trillion in 1 year, and that the deficit, which now the national debt, which now absorbs 100% of the annual deficit as new debt, as well as absorbing the increased interest on the national debt as new debt. The deficit is now, the debt is now increasing at $1 trillion a quarter, and seems destined to continue to do so until something breaks. We don't know what is going to break because we are in completely uncharted territory here. Next slide, please. Okay. We know that the allocation of credit is not a fully productive allocation of credit because the GDP is not growing at a 1-to-1 or greater ratio, that is a ratio to the credit allocated to public debt. Next slide. The public debt, untouched as it will be untouched, as it cannot be touched by current fiscal power of Congress, will reach 200% of real GDP within 1 year. This has never happened to a leading modern industrial economy. The closest example we can find is probably the collapse of the British Empire under the cumulative debt of 2 world wars as a percentage of their GDP, but we're already in excess of that. And let me say that investment in war, investment in the military industrial complex generally, is not truly productive. If you're building things in order to blow them up, those things should probably not be counted as the national production. And that's true of services as well as of goods. If you are enlisting people in a wartime economy, in order that their services be put to destructive uses, then the service side as well as the goods side of your putatively productive economy is actually not productive. But unless war becomes a permanent condition, as it certainly was for the British Empire, then that should just be an edge case. Unfortunately, it's probably no longer an edge case for us. But the two main cases should be the productive and the non-productive allocation of credit. The productive allocation of credit goes directly to fuel GDP growth. And by that, we hope we mean real growth, not just the growth in destruction. And non-productive use of credit goes ultimately to fuel asset bubbles because it is misallocated away from the truly productive economy. Next slide. Okay. Is our current situation a war economy or not a war economy? Well, if we take the Second World War in the United States economy as the benchmark of what a war economy looks like, it's not a war economy. Though, on the other hand, when we see the lobbyists of the military industrial complex running around Capitol Hill these last 2 months trying to sell the supplemental military aid bills as job creators in all 50 states, perhaps as a de facto matter, we do have a permanent war economy. Next slide, please. Okay, the expansion of non-productive credit necessarily goes to fuel asset bubbles. If it goes into something other than production, which will result in a one-to-one or better increase in product, then it becomes financialization. And the only question is what lucky asset class is chosen for the financialization that becomes such an asset bubble. Next slide, please. All right. It's the asset bubbles that demonstrate price inflation. At the very beginning, I said inflation is expansion of the money supply, but since there is no money supply, since 1971, there is only a credit supply, then asset bubbles demonstrate that price inflation is the symptom. That price inflation exists precisely because of the etiological process I claim is going on here. That if the allocation of credit through expansion of credit and then the use of that credit for a non-productive rather than a productive outcome, if that did not produce a price inflation in the favored asset class to which that credit is directed, then my whole argument would fall apart. However, this hypothesis is not falsified by any evidence we see in the real economy now. We are seeing that there are asset bubbles which predictably arise out of the specific misallocation of credit to those asset classes. Next slide, please. Okay. What are we calling the rate of inflation in the economy. Well, when you see talk of the inflation rate in the press, and that includes the press releases of the Treasury and the Fed, uh, they're talking about the symptom. They're talking about price inflation. They're talking about where the bubbles are, though they won't admit that those are bubbles. Now, I tried with the January numbers to apply the 1980 methodology for computing the consumer price index to the current numbers. It's mostly possible to do that, although the way in which the numbers are published, as opposed to the way they were published 40 years ago, makes it difficult. I can tell you that if you take the numbers for January of this year and subject them to the methodology that was used for CPI by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1980, you will get an annual inflation rate slightly in excess of 11%, price inflation rate in the consumer economy of in excess of 11%, as opposed to, of course, the 3.4% that the Fed's favored figures are giving us. Well, why is that? Well, they don't like the real numbers, and the real numbers do not support their narrative. So they use the statistician's favorite trick, and in so doing, prove what a trick it is of removing the two outliers in the price inflation numbers of the economy. And the two outliers which they have been removing, first in what they called core CPI, which is the consumer price index as computed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, minus food and fuel. And then later in what's now the Fed's favored number, which is called core CPE, that's the consumer prices as computed by the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the Treasury, but again, with the outliers removed, and the outliers, of course, are food and fuel, which between them accounted for something approximating 70% of the price inflation. All that demonstrates to an honest analyst is that food and fuel are in price inflation asset bubbles because they have been allocated public credit, which is to say expanded money supply, to use the old terms. But that has resulted in a price inflation which interferes with the Fed's narrative. Therefore, as a statistical matter, they are considered outliers and are removed from the calculation of core CPE. Next slide, please. Right. Housing was not removed from core PCE. Sorry, that should say CPE. So, not surprisingly, that was where the price inflation showed up last month in the February statistics. The bulk of the price inflation has been in food and fuel. They've been removed as statistical outliers. So, of course, what is now going to show up as the largest factor of price inflation in the figures that the Fed is publishing is going to be number 3, the one that hasn't been removed as an outlier, which was housing. And incidentally, if you want to look at the methodology that's being used by the Bureau of Economic Analysis to compute the housing cost numbers. It's something I'm not sure it can actually be explained. So I can have no confidence in how it's being applied by the hands turning the statistical crank. But it's something called owner equivalent financing cost. I'll leave it at that. Third degree assumptions pretty much make it clear that you have no concrete numbers. You're abstracting from abstractions in order to reach abstractions in the third order. Next slide, please. Okay. Terminal conclusions. All US securities, and not just securities, but asset classes. So this includes obviously commodities, but they're showing up as food and fuel in the dominant statistics of price inflation. But all US securities are in a financialization, price inflation, asset bubble. Next slide. This includes Treasury securities. Now, this is the most interesting development that I've seen. There is, in fact, a bull market in Treasuries, which is why, since the beginning of this year, rates are staying steady. There's buying appetite for US Treasuries. Why? Because they are securities in a financialization asset bubble. The same reason that we see new highs in the S&P 500 for equities is the reason we see good, high, steady prices for US Treasuries. And that's a very good thing because the Treasury is going to have to roll over. It can't, of course, pay off any of the debt, but it's going to have to roll over some $9 trillion in this calendar year, as well as adding to the debt both the annual deficit, the deficit between revenues and expenses, and the interest cost, having gone from essentially zero over 12 years' time to now something on the order of 5%. So for the moment, the Fed and the Treasury are cruising because the Fed has managed, by draining the reverse repo facility, which was an allocation of credit that competed with the Treasury market. And before the Treasury market caught up to the actual rising rates in the economy, the reverse repo facility was where those needing overnight return parked their money. As the yield on short-term T-bills has surpassed the yield in the Fed's reverse repo facility, it has been drained. It's been drained from essentially it's gone from the entire credit market to zero in the course of this year. I mean, there's some residual amount left there, but if you're investing for yield, there's no point in taking a lower yield in the reverse repo market than you can get in the short-term Treasury market, which is being buoyed in an asset bubble created by the Fed's allocation of credit to it. Now, the question is, how long can this go on? And the only honest answer is nobody knows. This is completely novel and has never been seen before. How much worldwide appetite is there for financializing the public credit created by the Fed into the various assets that are now buoyed by bubbles, including most prominently Treasury securities? And for how long is there such an appetite? We'll get to 200% debt to GDP this year. Is that too much? Nobody knows. 400% be too much? Nobody knows. The only thing we can reliably say is that when the bubble bursts, it will burst completely. Next slide, please. Okay, now we come to what tonight's talk should have been about, and I'm going to simply move straight to conclusory opinions based on the methodology of semantic elaboration. And the Fed's other mandate, of course, is to control unemployment. Well, how does the Fed measure unemployment? Counted jobs are a double negative. That is, there's a job if there's not an unemployment report, which means that the job market, or specifically certain segments of the job market, have become another asset class favored by the allocation of public credit. And of course, that produces an asset bubble. In this case, apparently full employment, given the number of jobs that are counted. However, next slide. This is the hard and inconvenient fact, which cannot be explained by any economic data published by the Fed or the Treasury. There are more than 5 million provable unfilled jobs in the productive economy, but those jobs are not counted because they don't meet the double negative of not reporting unemployment. In other words, we have a distortion, a bubble, in this case, an employment asset bubble, which is produced in the counted jobs of the economy by the Fed's allocation of public credit, which otherwise can't explain the actual numbers that we don't see published. All right, nobody, as far as I can tell, has raised his hand in outrage. Oh, Alan, yes, okay.
Yes, thank you. To unmute myself.
Alan, you have Alan, you have two devices connected to the house.
Sorry, let me turn down that speaker and turn up my other. Say something. Abraham, say something. Let me see if I have it.
Yeah, you are still having echoes.
All right, well, I can only listen on one device and I can only speak on the other at present, unless I can get the volume up on this one. I muted it. Hang on, if I can unmute it.
We're
All right,
all
try
having
again. Say
technical
something, please.
issues.
Got it. Got it. All right, now. Now, does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. So, one very simple yes or no. CPE, I was looking up, is that personal consumer expansion, expenditure?
Yes, which,
Okay.
I mean, it's now in its second iteration, which is so-called core, which excludes the outliers of food and fuel.
Oh, I
But
didn't use to.
what?
Okay. And it didn't use to.
It was distorted in the February numbers because even with food and fuel taken out as statistical outliers, the price inflation showed up in housing, which of course it would because that was the largest single favored misallocation of credit
Right.
that hadn't been removed.
So when I remember hearing long ago that food and fuel weren't counted in CPI and stuff like that. When in core inflation, when did that first occur where they removed it? Do you know? The actual year?
Yeah, I mean, I used to run these numbers routinely with the old CPI methodology in 1980. And after Volcker came in, he was extremely honest
Sorry.
about the numbers.
Yeah,
He wanted the worst possible numbers to show up in CPI, precisely because that justified his tightening. At the current changes began under Bernanke, and we're now in the third iteration. It had gone first from CPI as computed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to so-called core CPI, which removed the outliers, and then they went to the Bureau of Economic Analysis within the Treasury instead because they liked the numbers better. And now those numbers have had the outliers removed. Not surprisingly, those outliers are food and fuel, but those are the numbers the Fed likes.
Alan, you are muted.
Sorry, maybe I should leave it at that and let you continue. I had another question, but later.
Okay, no. I want to encounter the questions now. I've made the case as best I can make it, and if people want to attack the foundation of the logic, this is the time for it.
Yeah, these are not attacking the logic at all. I'm very appreciative of what you're bringing us. Just simple questions of what's that acronym mean? And okay, so this one is productive credit versus non-productive credit. And you characterize as non-productive credit as financialization. Would you put such a thing as a consumption loan under financialization, like a car loan? Well, what would be a consumption loan? Somebody gets a loan and they spend it for, I don't know, ongoing household expenses or something.
All right. I'm not going to make that call. And I've chosen my methodology precisely so I won't have to make such calls, because the labeling you're talking about is ontological labeling.
Okay.
It is nouns and noun constructs. It is saying that this is an XYZ loan because it meets the schema of an XYZ loan considered as a noun. I say we are not using ontological constructs in our semantic methodology. We're using only etiological transactional paths of provenance so that we say that credit was allocated to this particular use. Doesn't matter what it's called as a noun. Doesn't matter what schema it corresponds
I understand.
to.
So
As
it's
a
really,
verb, credit was allocated to it. Now, if the allocation of credit to that thing produces at least a one-to-one increase in GDP, then it is by definition a productive use of credit. If allocation of credit to that thing does not produce at least a one-to-one increase in GDP, then it is by definition a financialization, a
yeah.
creation of an asset bubble by favoring an asset class with public credit.
Yeah. So you read it by the results, if I may.
I read it as verbs, not as
Yeah.
nouns.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Marty?
Yeah, appreciate the talk. So in previous discussions, we decided that the selling of treasuries so that we can do spending was kind of illogical in the sense that it's the federal government that creates the currency or the money, and there's really no logical reason for treasuries to be sold. But now I'm hearing that that operation is critical for the cruising, as you explained, to keep the appearance that the economy is I guess on autopilot, I suppose. Is that a true expression of what you're trying to say?
Well, yes, I would put it this way. The Fed and the Treasury, whether by intent or by accident, and I suspect it's by accident, have created the greatest pump and dump of all time. And they have created an asset value, an asset bubble, which inflates the price of Treasury securities at just the moment when they need to sell an unprecedented amount of Treasury securities into the market. When does the pump and dump end? Nobody knows.
But logically, federal government creating the money and then having to pay interest to to justify the money that they just created. It doesn't make any sense to borrow money that they created. I guess that's the point I was trying to make.
But it works exactly like a Pink Sheets pump and dump. I mean, the underlying company makes no economic sense. The use of your little Pink Sheets company is that you can create an asset bubble with artificial enthusiasm and appetite for that security, and then unload as much of that security as you possibly can. I mean, we saw exactly this 2 years ago with the meme stocks, to the point that AMC sold all the authorized shares they had, and then they couldn't get any more authorized shares because they couldn't get a majority of their shareholders to vote on the proxy question. The Fed and the Treasury don't have that problem. They have created a pump and dump, and they have no choice, since taxes cannot be raised and spending cannot be cut, to continue to sell treasuries into that asset bubble for as long as the asset bubble exists.
So if you had your elevator speech for a presidential candidate, what would be the one sentence you would say?
Well, I suppose I should have started with not a land acknowledgement, but a land value tax acknowledgement, because the more we do this, the more I utterly appreciate Henry George. When it collapses, the only thing that is going to be taxable is going to be land, taxable at a local level, on what I have called in other discussions a feudal basis. That is, the collection of ground rents from those in the community who use the land. And the only spending there's going to be is local spending, which is going to look very much like some form of UBI. That is, the local community is going to spend money where it chooses to spend money, having raised it from the land value tax within its own community. And further up the chain at the county level and the state level and the federal level, they're simply going to receive something that looks very much like tithes to a feudal overlord. But the vast majority of both revenue and spending is going to be entirely local. I mean, this thing I was at last night, one of the participants was Andrew Yang. And for the man who brought the UBI back to the attention of the American public in his presidential run, I mean, I buttonholed him at one point and said, we should talk about Henry George. And he looked at me in horror like, oh my God, you don't mean I have to discuss what's behind the slogan? I've been running for president on UBI. Do I actually have to explain the mechanics of UBI? And then he just took off, you know, over his shoulder saying, I love Henry George. Well, great. Let's talk about how to implement Henry George. But yeah, I can't predict. The party system is going to collapse along with the polarized policies it has created. When you have one party that will not cut spending and one party that will not raise taxes, you get what we've got now. The problem is we've never seen this before. Yeah. So, you know, presumably we see a collapse before we see what comes next.
Well, appreciate it. That was a good answer. Thanks.
Joe?
Hi, thanks, Dr. Perry, for this very thought-provoking presentation. I guess I come to these webinars looking for measures to address these problems that you're describing. You just mentioned one in terms of Henry George, adopting Henry George's taxes on unearned income. And as Richard Demers pointed out, there's several ways of doing that, locally, as you mentioned, also federally, in terms of changing capital gains inclusion rates for things like real estate. You could capture a lot that way as well. But I'm also looking for Henry George's other side, which is greenbacks. It seems to me what you're proving is that we need to change the monetary system, that money should be sovereign and it shouldn't be credit and it shouldn't be bank created. And the other thing that concerns me is you've mentioned this problem with the two parties not cutting spending and not raising taxes, but I'd like to see some sort of judgment about these two positions, because my own impression is that the government isn't spending enough on health, on education, on infrastructure, on housing, other necessities for the American people, and that the Republican Party has been for some time, from Reagan to Bush to Trump, have been advocating the agenda of the plutocrats, and whether it's getting their Supreme Court judges nominated or cutting taxes when we couldn't afford those cuts. It just seems to me that I'm not saying that the Democrats do everything right by any means, but I'm just saying that the fundamental problem seems to be a plutocratic agenda promoted by the Republicans, whose politicians have been bought and paid for. Do you
No,
have any? Do you have any?
I understand that that's what you think. And you are one of those people who gave me extensive feedback, and I'm about 15 pages into a written response to you over the last week or so. But it comes down to this, that you're perfectly entitled to make this a moral opinion, but the moral opinion cannot by definition be a political one. And that's actually the meaning of separation of church and state. And I ask people all the time, who first articulated the separation of church and state? And it was Jesus of Nazareth. And he did it in the most effective way that it could possibly be done. A delegation was sent by the Pharisees to trip him up. And they asked, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And that's not a facetious question. That's not a specious question. Jewish law was quite settled that it was a violation of the first commandment to pay any tax other than the temple tax, because to honor anyone with tribute in the form of taxation other than God was to put whoever that authority was over God. And as Jesus pointed out, it's also a violation of the second commandment. He asked to see a Roman coin, and of course it has Caesar's image on it. And this is the use of a graven image for the purpose of giving glory to Caesar, and thereby a clear violation of the second commandment. And you're not going to make the Romans go away.
No,
I mean,
Dr. Perry, aren't I just reflecting the spirit of Henry George, progress and poverty? That this is
well,
a political
but
agenda which ensures poverty.
I'm separating the moral from the mechanics. And the fact is that if the revenue is raised in the community, and when I say community, I mean a consenting polity that agrees on, let's call them by their proper feudal name, the ground rents for the land under the community's sovereignty, and agrees on the allocation of those revenues to the needs of the community, subject only to the feudal tithing by the overlords at county and state and federal levels, you are resolving the moral question in the only way that a moral question can be resolved, which is by consent. Consensus is on its face a human rights violation. Consensus means that when I can assemble a 51% majority, I am entitled to tyrannize the 49%. And in order to make that impossible, it is necessary to separate church and state, to separate belief from civil authority, including the authority to compel and the authority to tax. If you have a local community, which by definition forms a community out of consent, then by virtue of being that consenting community, they control the land within their sovereignty, decide on the proper level of, I'm going to continue to call them ground rents for the land, and on the proper allocation of those revenues within the community. It is the only place where the moral and the compulsory civil imperatives can meet and agree, and that is where there is consent. 100% consent. And if you don't like the community, you go to a different one.
It seems to me that if you want to fix the apocalypse you're describing, then you have to educate people as to why it's taking place. And clearly it's taking place because of a corrupt plutocracy, plutocratic process. It's been a hijacking of the American legal system and electoral system, whether it was the Supreme Court decision on funding elections, whether it's been the constant tax cuts, which have disenabled government from meeting the needs of the people, and for allowing the accumulation of wealth beyond any unimaginable heights. The buying of politicians, some of them who are just bizarre people. Surely you've got to educate the people as to what's going on.
No one is ever educated by moralizing and polemic.
I don't think it's moralizing.
They're catechized.
It's corruption.
They're catechized. So you say, if they don't agree, they have exactly the same moral basis rooted in free will and consent to deem it not corruption.
Well, you know the book Manufacturing Consent, and that's what's been going on. It's been an incredible manipulation of the people.
You've got to back off on anything that falls from the mouth of Chomsky. So we'll stay away from that entirely. No, I mean, the only thing that's going to work, as Jesus perfectly demonstrated, and as Luther revived the question, and then as the separatist dissenters who realized that the wars of religion in Europe, particularly the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, was not about what was morally correct. It was about who got to be the dictator, who got to hold the magisterium, who got to decide what the tithe was used for. It was those separatist dissenters who left Europe and came to North America to create a true separation of church and state, which means that there is no moral authority, no magisterium in the hands of the civil authority.
Well, let's agree to disagree on that. What about the greenbacks? How come you're not moving toward the greenbacks?
Greenbacks were a great idea. There are three problems with creating greenbacks now. One, there are no banks. There's only the Fed. Two, there is no money. There is only credit. And three, there is no freedom to allocate the credit because of the voracious demands of the Treasury for not just the lion's share, but increasingly a share approaching all of the public credit. Absent those three things, greenbacks are a great idea, but the world we live in is dominated by those three things.
Well, I would say that greenbacks are sovereign money. They're not credit.
Well, all right. What is the reified unit of value in a greenback?
Money is a creature of the law. It's not some kind of commodity. even when there was gold, the gold standard, there was about 1/4 of the amount of gold that was required to actually be properly backed by gold. Gold, that's always been a canard. It's never been a true gold backing system. And of course, the gold backing system was what led to the Great Depression. So
who gets to say what the mark-to-market value of that money and securities denominated in that money is?
it's a creature of the law. The law,
Right.
it's a legal.
But in a world where the Fed and OFAC have simply invalidated the sovereign wealth of the Russian people and the dollar reserves of the Russian central bank, what law is applied?
uh, I would say it's like garnishing wages. The Russians have, it's like anybody who owes money to their spouse or to credit agency.
What court made judgment
Well,
that resulted in that garnishment?
Well, yeah, who you're back to morals here, but the Russian government forfeited their right to those things by doing what they did.
In other words, might makes right, which is.
That's what the Russians were doing. And this is a way of trying to.
It is not what the Russians were doing with respect to their money. They were holding US dollar reserves in order to be a responsible participant in the international monetary order.
Well, if you drive and you drink, you lose certain rights, right? This is just.
All right, I'm simply trying to distinguish here between.
This can be very, very controversial.
Well,
So
yes, but Ibrahima, it shouldn't be controversial because if we say that money is a creature of the law, we're entitled to ask of which law and as applied by which court using which procedure, when and how. Anyway, Peter's got his hand up.
Thank you.
Hi. Wow. Yeah. Fantastic discussion. I think I'm on the opposite side of you, Dr. Perry.
Most people are.
I know. Yeah, but enjoy it. It's it's great to hold court. So I guess I'll sacrifice what I was going to ask you and kind of piggyback on what everyone else is talking about. Your most recent comment to Joe about which law. Well, it's actually which people are making the laws. And so, and if you have kind of a greedy, sadistic, gluttonous people making laws, then you're going to have bad laws. But if you have, sane people, healthy people making laws, then you're going to have good laws. And there's no better evidence for this than anthropology. If you look, I left a link in the chat section of an essay written by the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. I think I'm sure you're familiar with him. He was director of the
my great hero.
Yeah, awesome.
I mean, the only other person I am completely certain of gets Darwin.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Because then you should you more than anyone else should read the link I posted. It's his
Kropotkin was no crackpot.
Right. He wrote that I think in the 1980s. Maybe it came out in the New York Times or the New Yorker or something. So basically, the 19th century evolutionary biologists believed that Darwin was incomplete, if not. I don't think anyone believed he was wrong out and out, but that competition isn't the default mechanism for social behavior. And
Darwin never said so. It never came close.
Well, okay, I never read Darwin, so I can't say, but other people believe he did.
Oh, I know. And too many of us are judged by what other people are completely certain we've said, which is quite often the polar opposite of what we have said and argued for and made logical presumptions of.
Right. Well, I mean, if you take a Bio 101 textbook, and just go year by year backwards, you'll see that altruism at some point, probably, I'm guessing, but I'm pretty sure, altruism as a form of behavior of the community inside a community is kind of a new addition to bio textbooks.
Right, but altruism is not scientifically measurable, and that's just the problem we're talking about. Altruism is a pattern,
Right.
an ontological construct in the minds of men, which is projected onto data from the natural world.
Everything.
That is the definition of intelligent design and the antithesis of Darwinian speciation. We can prove every aspect of true Darwinian speciation with an etiological model.
Oh,
There was a reified unit of value here, either in the genetic inheritance or in the environment, or in the particular combination of these particular circumstances, which was then reified in a novel way in the outcome.
Can you define reified?
It's the converse of abstracted.
Okay, yeah, manifested.
Something concrete,
Yeah.
which can actually be transacted in, rather than an abstract measure of the net effect of transaction.
Sure, you're kind of a postmodern.
It's the difference between a ledger and a coin. A ledger is
the abstraction.
A coin is a reification.
You know, I'm going to characterize you. I don't hope I'm not insulting you. As a kind of a postmodernist, if you will.
Oh God, no. Sending me to the hell of Derrida and Lacan and no, please don't.
There's too much wiggle room to disprove anything rather. I mean, if nothing can be linked to anything else, because in order to link A with B, you have to name A and name B, and since names are nouns.
No, you don't. No, that's the nominalist fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the cure for the nominalist fallacy is not antinomianism. It's actually the etiological proof.
And that takes time.
All right. Another of my heroes, Professor E.J. Corey at Harvard, professor of chemistry, won the Nobel Prize in 1990 for his 1988 book, The Logic of Chemical Synthesis, in which, as I read that book, he restated all of organic chemistry etiologically rather than ontologically. That is, the definition of protein X is not that protein X corresponds to this particular ontological schema. It is the path of synthesis by which X was created. 40 years later, nobody teaches etiological organic chemistry, even though it's as clearly valid as Darwinian speciation as opposed to intelligent design.
It does clearly what? I lost that. Clearly?
It is clearly valid scientifically as Darwinian speciation when compared to intelligent design. Everybody teaches some form of intelligent design, and that is now being enshrined in AI as it has been enshrined in the law by the case method these 150 years.
Computationally, it would be, you'd have so many zeros and only one. The arithmetic alone would burn up the planet to like make a computational model, for for
I
ideological.
do a lot of large number calculation. It's not really true. I mean, you know, what are we talking about? You're not even talking about the number of terahashes that go into the securing the present Bitcoin network, for example.
Well, in terms of like,
This is not computationally difficult.
well, actually, I was thinking more in terms of chemistry, but in the to think about context of everything and how something emerges out of the context, and you know, a world of verbs and so forth. I mean, no, it's I love your ideas, but it's as far as making a teachable model and something that you could put in a program and so forth, it would be. I don't know if I don't know computer science, but I don't know if we're up for that in terms of brute force, you know. But anyway, getting back to political economy. Okay, I'm going to call it quits for right now because I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. But thanks for answering my question, and perhaps I'll send you an email or something.
I would very much appreciate that.
Cool.
And if you're interested, I will point you to the actual computational primitives which I use, which are actually about as inexpensive as it gets, because we express verbs without needing to use verbs. It's the ultimate in functional programming. That is the transformation, the transaction, if you will, is defined by the full set of its inputs and the full set of its outputs.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to define the verb, which is, you know, the holy grail of functional programming, isn't it?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Please send the link. Maybe Alan Smith and I will try to, you know, Alan can help me. You know, Alan's the computer guy.
Definitely interested.
Yeah. Thank you.
Of course.
I see Joe has his hand raised. Joe, you want to come back, or was it before?
I do. I just want to ask a question. I don't want to create controversy.
Yeah, I'll give you the last word, Joe.
What I like about coming to Henry George webinars is that we have these fine minds giving us proposals about how to solve problems. You've described it as a very serious problem, or a series of them. Do you have a proposal or several proposals to help solve those problems?
Yes.
Good. Please elaborate.
I'm probably going to make a couple more proposals to Ibrahima, which will probably be more political than macroeconomic in their substance. But since I'm being true to my methodology, they will rely on the same computational semantic process of elaboration. So more to follow.
Okay,
Good.
I look forward to that.
Good to hear that, Dr. Perry. All right. So if we don't have any other questions or comments, I guess we could call it a night.
Thank all of you. Thank you, Ibrahima.
Thank you very much. And we'll meet again tomorrow for Ed Dodson's Understanding Our Political Economy. Good night, everyone.
See you. Great job.
Thank you.